Hey there, everybody. It's great to see you, sort of see you. This is Jay Frost speaking from the world headquarters of the Philanthropy Mastermind series. In other words, my home office. It's great to have you back. And as we head into the big part of the giving season, we are going to be having a great conversation with someone who has had more conversations with the kind of people that you'll hopefully be talking with at the end of the year than just about anybody else at the planet. So I'm really excited to introduce him to you and to have this conversation today. But I want to have that conversation with you. So as you just saw in these little slides, as we were leading up to the beginning today, we'd love to have you be a part of that if you want to, through the chat, through the Q&A, however you'd like to do that. We want to make sure that this is a part of, that you are part of this conversation. And so yeah, I want to thank Kate for already saying hello in the chat and warming that up for us a little bit. And I'm glad to hear it's beautiful just north of San Francisco, because we all know that it can be tough weather out there sometimes. It's actually warm here, and I've got a sweater on because it was cold this morning, and I just never took it off. So don't let that fool you. We have some great conversation to have, but before I do that, I also want to thank the sponsors of this series, which are, of course, the folks at DonorSearch. And we don't talk much about them during the sessions, but that doesn't mean we don't love them. We do. If it weren't for them, we couldn't have these conversations that we've been having since 2016, about 500 or so sessions, many of them recorded and up and available for you on the DonorSearch YouTube channel and on the DonorSearch site under the resources tab. There's also a schedule there of upcoming programs and all that stuff. So I hope you'll check it out there. And in fact, you'll see at the end of the program today a little QR code so you can learn more about both DonorSearch and its work with donors, but also more about the Philanthropy Mastermind series. So hope you'll check all that out. So once again, do be a part of the conversation if you'd like. We'd love to see that. And it's very helpful also to our guests to know that you're here. You can just say hi. We'd love that too. So I want to introduce to you our guest today, who is perhaps known to you by reputation, if not directly. And that is, of course, the president and CEO of Advancement Resources, Ben Golding. And Ben is a person who, once again, has had extraordinary conversations with so many leaders in the philanthropy sector, both in the US and abroad. In fact, he was just telling me he's been on, I think, 15 trips to the UK in the last 4 years. So a lot of those with university clients, but others too. We're going to hear all about it now. So thank you so much, Ben, for hanging out today.
Thanks, Jay. And also, Jack, really appreciate both you hosting and inviting. I think we started the conversation around what this series will be like on a bus ride in Indianapolis as we were talking about your trip to London. I think that was happening this past summer. But thrilled that we made it happen after those conversations, and very much looking forward to our discussion today.
Yeah, me too. And I should also give a shout out to the Giving Institute, because you're an integral part of that, and that's where that conversation was held, was part of that group. So if you're not familiar with the Giving Institute or Giving USA, I hope you'll check that out later, and we can always put a link to that in the chat as well. Do check that out. So Ben, I want to assume nothing here. So let's just start with that people don't know what Advancement Resources is, at least for context, because when I first talked to you about this, I knew about the firm only by reputation. And when you started describing the nature of some of the interviews you do with people and how you get to know them and what that is in terms of the learning process, or how people can get an education about philanthropy, I was really bowled over, because you essentially have a TV studio as an integral part of the practice. But let's just start from square one. What is Advancement Resources?
Well, if you haven't heard of Advancement Resources, I'm thrilled to introduce you to an organization I'm a proud part of and have been for over a decade. But really, the organization started in the late 90s with a focus on research, and in particular, what brings people to a place of generosity, what causes them to tip over and think about philanthropy in a meaningful way, to give, and sometimes to give beyond what they even imagined possible, to organizations and projects, programs that they care about. So, in starting that work in the late 90s, we were invited into that partnership by a small university. And they were looking to do something a little bit different. And so they gave us an opportunity to partner and work together. And that evolved into an opportunity to learn more, which we paused and took about 4 years to interview hundreds of donors of all different demographics, wealth capacities, institutional giving profiles. And that became a foundation of our understanding of what was possible, what could be learned about donor motivation that would maybe drive better practice. And to be fair, more joy into the work of the profession of advancement. So we named the company Advancement Resources, wanting to be a partner, a resource to those professionals looking to grow their career, looking to grow their understanding, to institutional leaders, university presidents, deans, provosts, other academics. And we've been fortunate enough to grow to include medicine as an audience. So we work with clinicians as well. And about 10 years ago, we expanded beyond the US into Canada, the UK, Australia, Singapore. We now have work being done in Africa and the Middle East. And it's been very rewarding to be part of organizational culture change as they do adopt a more donor-centric mindset with sort of the institution's mission in focus. How can they bring donors on board that want to be a part of that great work? And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. All that research continues. We interview about 400 donors a year from a variety of different institutions, feed that back into the learning experiences, which is really how the research meets the application, is through coaching, learning, training opportunities that our team brings forward. There's about 40 of us now spread out across the globe.
Oh, wow.
And we're really passionate about this work.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand how you move from that world of just diving into these conversations into turning that into, I don't know, the bulwark of kind of a learning process for clients, but also for the sector. How did that happen?
So I think when we are, what we're probably best at is this intentional curiosity, right? The wanting to understand the puzzle of how things work. And those early partnerships included partnerships with institutions that had, one was Mayo Clinic and Jim Hodge, an incredibly successful individual who wanted to share. Dave Dunlap out at Cornell, and many, many others. Part of that, here's what we do, here's how we do it, but recognizing that when you want to cascade that and train others on how to do some of this donor-centric work, you have to really be intentional about defining the process. So our team spent those 4 years that I talked about really building a process that could be repeated and be adopted by institutions. And so the process piece of it is, how do I take now and understanding a donor-centric mindset? What are donors looking to accomplish through their philanthropy? What can we do on the process side? Those things that are both empowered by technology and sometimes challenged by technology. What can we do to advance the relationships in the profession itself? And so that became what we for the last 15, 17 years have been training.
So I'm imagining a couple things. First of all, 17 years ago, I know we were on the internet, but the internet then was not the internet now.
Right.
And the tools that we used then are not the tools we use now. So I know this isn't a history lesson today, but what was it like when you started doing that? I mean, were you going to them with like early stage, video cameras and then recording interviews? And I mean, what was it like for the people you were interviewing to try and collect that information? It must have been kind of a different relationship.
These things called tapes, right? So back then, video was actually captured on magnetic tape. Still, some of the high-end cameras will still use tape, but no, we would sit down in an environment like somebody's office or a boardroom or a space. Many times we do it at the kitchen table at a donor's house. They invite us in the house. So we come in with a video crew, with lighting, with all of that the mic equipment. And yeah, none of the, in fact, all the way up until just a few years ago, we would never capture an interview online. Everything was done in person, and still over half of our interviews, even today, are still in-person live interviews. They take about an hour, and the output of that many times is a very respectful, reflective sort of set of chunks of information they provide, and they're very personal. That's the thing about we now walk in with the Kleenex box, because there's almost never an interview, even with the most stoic individual, that emotion doesn't arise through that process of inviting them to talk about their giving, their
Okay, and I know we are really going to get to talking about learning and tech impact on all this, but I have to ask you about the questions that you're posing to people that let them get into this kind of vulnerable state where you need the tissue box. Maybe more importantly, what allows them to feel comfortable to be talking to you, not just, well, first of all, to a third party, and then secondly, to do so in front of a camera, or at least being recorded. What are you asking them? How is that happening?
So it's fascinating. We actually train, we have just a handful of interviewers on the team who are just exceptionally good at this. First and foremost, the context in which they're invited into this. Generally, their institution has selected them to participate. So let's say University of Cambridge, partnership we had with them, they selected 10 individuals to participate. We pick an environment that will be conducive to this, but it's that eye contact, it's that super intentional listening and asking, and then listening and asking, that I would say in about the first 5 to 10 minutes, the camera disappears. Like mentally, you're in this storytelling mode. And the reality is, donors, and sometimes it's a donor couple, have the opportunity to be real, right? There is nothing about this that is threatening. There is no commitment other than a willingness to tell their story. And I'll be really frank, there aren't a lot of people who really ask us our story and want to spend an hour probing and digging and inviting deeper understanding. And when it is not, when the ultimate objective is that through sharing their story, they can help their institution train their team to be better fundraisers, that's pretty compelling. So getting them in the room is not hard. Getting them going and talking is really it's all about intentionality. And there's a series of questions that sort of opens that up. And one of the most important things is giving them an opportunity to share about what they've already done philanthropically, what that came from, lived experiences, and then what they want to do going forward. And in the span of 45 minutes to an hour, you just get this rich tapestry of personal experience, and they love it because it's their story. You love telling your story. That's why I love being on this and being invited to do this with you, Jay. I mean, this is not all that different, right? It's an opportunity to talk about something we really care about.
Well, and that's the thing about our sector, is that we're often in the position of asking these questions, but often not interviewed ourselves. So it's great to talk with someone who's spending a lot of time doing that. So kind of a follow-up question to that, I think maybe one of the reasons why organizations don't fully have this kind of process is not just because they need to learn the best ways of conducting it and knowing how to use the technology to the advantage of the process, but also in a way that's appropriate and sensitive to the people we're conversing with. But it's also sometimes that we ourselves are self-conscious about being recorded. It's if we're doing a feasibility study and we're sitting with someone, or we're talking to a donor or something like that, then we can put all the focus on them. But when you enter the third party, that camera in the room, does that change things? So it doesn't for you because you're used to it. But how is it for other people who have entered your team, for people you've worked with on the client side, and when you've talked to others in the sector where this kind of vulnerable interview can be really important as ambassadorship for why people give and why people give to that particular institution? How have you gotten them comfortable being an interviewer like that? We're not all cut out for 60 minutes. How does it work?
Well, we for our team, we both train and we sort of audit, and we find those that are capable of doing it and doing it well. and digging is it's always that extra question, right? The one question beyond what most people would be comfortable asking, being willing to ask it. Because again, if you're the donor and you're sharing your story, you've opened the door and you've allowed sort of this journey to begin. And taking that one additional step is sometimes very, very difficult, and where most people wouldn't be willing to go. And I'd say that's the one thing for those listening on this to this or watching this, that if you are in a conversation with a donor, to have that willingness, be a little bit bolder and be able to take and ask that one additional question. So somebody shares with you a personal story behind their struggle, maybe getting into university and being funded, and we sort of capture that surface level story, and that's sort of obviously ties their passion around scholarship, but really probing in to help them, to give them a chance to describe the struggle, to give them a chance to describe some of the decisions they had to make, to really get to a place where they can make it more personal and be more clear. The more we understand about a donor story, the better we're going to be at figuring out a way for them to be really empowered by their philanthropy and get really excited about it. And again, I talk about joy, like this is really about bringing that what we do back to the surface and seeing the excitement that can come from donors finding things that they want to do within the institution.
It must be a really fulfilling thing to give people the opportunity to celebrate those things that they love, that they're passionate about, and the journey that took them there. But it has a practical side too, doesn't it? I mean, if you're asking these questions, what is the value to the institution of going beyond the perfunctory questions and asking that bit more, probing a bit more? What's the value?
So there's two parts to that. The value in the ability to use this information for training is that we can clearly demonstrate that with the right approach to asking questions, this sort of interactive, very engaged approach with any sort of audience, but in particular donor audience, can yield pretty significant information if you're willing to go down that journey. And that's part of the training. The training is to be willing to go into a deeper level of discovery. But there's a component here too, and this is going to be a bit about our technology part of this conversation, which is that sometimes we can get in our own way. And so we kind of walk into these conversations and say, and we really encourage our interviewers, and we even will tell our clients, our partners, the institutions we're working with, like, I'm going to be dumb here. I'm going to ask questions in a way to indicate I don't know what the likely answer is. But the reality is it's because what we read, what we see, what we know about a donor may not be the entire story.
Right.
And unless we lead them, like, tell me about this experience, right? Having read a bio of them, I really want to know about X, and instead allow them to identify those key moments, those key points. So you've got to act a little dumb sometimes, and I say that you really have to be willing to listen more and ask questions that will open the door to a deeper conversation. And sometimes it's hard, right? We have all this knowledge. Technology provides us all this information and contextualizes everything for us, and yet it's not necessarily the personal story, right? It's like walking in to talk about a potential opportunity institution, knowing that this person graduated from this school, 20 years prior, has been focusing on this area, has grown a business in this area, and walking in and assuming that those are those areas of philanthropic interest without spending the time to sort of uncover what might be burning for them, and an issue that is something that you can absolutely address through philanthropy. So you gotta kind of check the ego at the door a bit and allow the donor to take you on that journey.
Yeah, it's not about the interviewer; it's about the interviewee, I guess.
That's hard.
That's yeah. Well, sure. Although I guess if you're a curious interviewer, then it's because you're looking for what the story really means, not just the facts. You're looking for the meaning. So
that's right.
I can imagine that that's really a lot of fun.
Somebody asked me the other day, what are the two attributes that make the best development professionals that we've seen, and haven't seen tens and tens of thousands of them. Two things stand out. And you just mentioned one of them, curiosity. So a willingness to be curious. And the second is grit. Just being able to to manage yourself through some of the more difficult experiences you'll have in doing the work of philanthropy, but curiosity and grit. And so being curious is sort of almost a prerequisite to being successful in philanthropy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, especially when it comes to the kind of thing you're talking about, this high level. And that's the thing, I guess, that you can encourage or teach or inculcate through these different learning platforms. And you talked a minute ago about, you alluded to the collision in the title of this session when you're talking about sometimes the technology is our friend. You didn't say it exactly like this, but sometimes it gets in our way. I didn't probe, though, what you mean by it getting in the way. So can you talk a little bit about how, especially in view of what you just said, how we started with tapes and high end is still there a little bit, but today it might be an interview like this. You just alluded to that. We can't always be on site. Sometimes it just isn't going to work for the person you're meeting with. But how does technology assist us regardless, and how does it sometimes get in our way?
What a great question and a broad question, Jay. Let's talk about sort of how does technology assist us? And how is this different than it was 20 years ago, right? Which was a question you asked earlier. Certainly the interview process is different, but the information available today is amazing, right? Through a variety of resources, we can know more, we can anticipate more, we can provide, we have more curated information today. And with the adoption of artificial intelligence, it's going to only get better. And yet, and there's a huge caveat here, and yet, if we give an individual an incredibly, I mean, I think about it as, putting a very new driver in the seat of a very powerful sports car. It is incredibly powerful and it can do beautiful things, amazing things. But if you're inexperienced, it can also do very terrible things. And I think our challenge today is that often we make these tools and this information available without context. And
Yeah.
so a development professional can, one of two things, get lost with the abundance of information, not to understand, not to be given the tools and the context to sort of identify what's most important. And the second is using that information to make assumptions about the donor, what they would do, when they would do it, the size of the contribution they make, without the context of knowing the individual, the personal conditions in which they see themselves, how they see their philanthropy, how they see themselves in the family environment that they're in, and all of those things that really can't be found through research, AI empowered or not, that really come down to a human to human discussion and information that we can collect through others that may know the donor, potential donor. And so I think we have the most powerful tools that we've ever had to be successful in the work. And what we're challenged to do is make sure that we're deploying those and using those in an effective and appropriate and ethical way.
And so when we think about this in terms of the learning that comes from it, so you go in and you conduct a suitable number of interviews, I suppose, with a university client or a healthcare system, and you're getting a sense about what a certain group of individuals, with their relationship, what it's been like over time, what informs their philanthropy, their interest. That's, I'm sure, very helpful. But it probably needs, as you're pointing out, context. Only a certain amount of that context is provided by the editing, I guess. Like this interview right now, afterwards, Jack, our producer, will turn this into maybe 2 or 3 little videos of 30 seconds in length. The advantage of that is maybe it gives people a window on some of your insights, but then there's not the context of the rest. So it's like an appetizer. But the problem with that is it ends up being like tapas, where now we've got so many dishes, we're not really sure, have we just had a meal, or do we really need to go and have the rest of this thing? So I'm wondering, when you've created that content, whatever masterful editing you've done, how then are you utilizing it as a platform to teach? And how is that different maybe from what I'm sure you also do, which is to sit down with people and coach them, which might be a little bit different from just showing them what it looks like versus doing it with you?
Yeah. Well, in the training environment, and this is how I think also we recognize that technology has played a role in training as much. The evolution of training over the last 20 years allows us to do things today that we only dreamed possible even just 5 years ago. One of those is the ability to shift to a more virtual platform like we're doing today. You've seen obviously the explosion in sort of technology enabled learning environments. When we take the context provided from donor interviews and we build a customized learning experience for a client, that the interviews themselves provide more of a institutional flavor to the training and may guide the development of specific exercises. But most of our training, even if it's virtual, is still very much a instructor-led or facilitated discussion. We found that the learning environment where teams work together is the most productive. So having groups of professionals that are going through a training experience working together. And then there is a nice cadence to this where you can have like an excerpt from a video, a taste, right, of one of these interviews can be part of learning about a process, right? And so if we're describing donors being motivated by things that maybe it aren't obvious, to have a donor from that institution actually talk about one of the things they're most passionate about that would be outside of what sort of a primary assumption of that individual donor's interests are, reinforces the point that through discovery, we can get to the level deeper beyond just what our research provides at the surface level. So when technology, when we're able to bring these interviews in, it provides, it's almost as if the donor's participating in the learning experience. They get to share their story. They get to talk about what it feels like to be philanthropic. And that's both good and bad. They also share some of the challenges that they have. And that may be harder to do if they were live in person to say, hey, don't do this or don't do this again. But in context, we can provide that to the organization.
There's so many questions that I had in my mind as you were going through that, but one of them has to do with silence. And I remember Jerry Panis doing this a lot in his sessions, where he would conduct mock interviews in trainings. And not this kind of training you're talking about with a single client where you're going in depth, but just a big group of people from all over the country. They all got together and then they rehearsed. And one of the things he would always do is have people kind of look at their watches when people use watches and find out how many, what it felt like to wait for 17 seconds before somebody said something. It might have been in response to a request for support, but it might have been something else. I'm wondering if you do take things and are able to utilize those segments of interviews as a demonstration tool so people can learn how best to facilitate an honest, sincere, beneficial conversation. The whole of the video or the whole of sitting with someone is part of that is silence, isn't it? And how do you work with people to get comfortable with not inserting themselves into that silence, with giving people a chance to think and really
one section of this is the funny thing, this is where I pause 17 seconds, right? No, but Jay, I think that you do a couple things. First of all, you provide the guidance, right? And so in addition to not only interviewing donors, we interview development leaders, development experts,
right,
academic leaders. And this type of learning points, when we in one of the trainings we'll actually do a role play, a scenario around inviting a philanthropic contribution. What does that look like? And the very last point, sort of in the whole discussion of how do you frame an invitation, is be quiet. And it always gets a laugh, but we, remind people that, look, we remind the learners that are participating in the session, whether it's an academic dean or a new development officer, experienced development officer, that if you've done all of the work right along the way, and you have a reasonable invitation, first of all, the donor's not likely to be surprised. So And you almost always work against yourself if you don't do what Jerry Penna suggests, which is pause, wait, allow them. And I wouldn't even say 17 seconds. I say, do not be the next person to speak, right? Like, period. Don't. And if you're there with your dean, don't let the dean be the next person to speak. Let the donor respond to what you've invited. And it's pretty straightforward. And it does come up in these interviews that we have. There are clearly times where it's not appropriate to ask the next question, but just to wait. And you can see it many times. You can see it in the person you're talking to. You're really paying attention. If you're not just looking at a list of questions and going through them one by one, but you're really paying attention, you know if they're in the middle of what they're trying to describe. And sometimes that, and we call it a pregnant pause, but sometimes that pause allows them to just gather a bit more of their thoughts and continue describing that maybe very sensitive situation. And it's amazing what people will share if you just sit there and listen. If you just give them a chance to talk, you can learn amazing things.
How much, and I promise I'm going to go back to team-based versus individual, because that's a big part of our discussion. But I keep asking about interviews, but how prepared are the interview subjects, whether they're donors or leaders or whatever? In other words, do you provide them the list of questions in advance?
This is the hardest thing to describe to my partners at the institution. Is the less prepared they are, the better they will be. They will be more authentic. I mean, Jay, come on, it's like this. I don't have prepared.
You don't know what I'm going to say.
Yeah, I don't know what you're going to ask me next. The most authentic you're going to find a person is when you've described this conversation, a conversation about philanthropy, about their personal experience, describe why we're doing this, that it's an opportunity for others to learn from what they've experienced, to improve what we're doing. But that really it's going to be a discussion about them and their own personal story. And that makes some people terribly uncomfortable. Not mostly donors, mostly it's a university president that will flat refuse.
Yeah, like, talk about that. Why do you think that is? Talk about that.
I just think I don't think there's a harder job in the world today, first of all, than a university president.
Why?
The amount of stakeholders you have to answer to. Yeah. And I think just being caught, for all the right reasons, being cautious, right? As the institutional head, you represent many times a very large organization, and you don't want to be taken out of context. So being scripted is safe. And so the alternative we provide is that we won't publish anything without their approval. So if we capture an interview and we edit it down to a couple of clips of an appropriate length, they'll have the sign-off authority before anyone else sees it. It'll just be edited. And that's another promise that goes to donors, to all participants, right? Is that we don't identify the participants of the interview. So unless I'm at an institution, I won't identify even a university president. I won't identify a donor. We won't. This is a collective we, right? The entire team. Right. Our commitment is, just because you've been interviewed about philanthropy doesn't mean that people from institutions all over the country will now be calling you because you've shared your philanthropic story with us. So it's not about, this is what this couple did, and this is how much, and this is the who, because then they'd be getting calls from any institution we trained and provided some of that contextual video for. So that's another commitment on our part, is we don't share the interviewees' names when we share their information, when we share their video clip.
I'm really glad you touched on both the university president piece as well as about expectation setting, because it's so important, including whether or not there's a provision of questions. And I'm asked sometimes, even doing things like this, if I can provide the questions in advance. And I usually try to skirt around that, because I like you, I would rather have people be themselves. And it's difficult to do that if you've prepared a great deal. So there's a line between letting people know roughly what we're going to talk about, and then letting them script something which doesn't let them, be their authentic selves. But that said, we were talking before about, again, team-based versus individual, and I just totally went away from it, and it's very important. So this is about team-based versus individual learning, and you talked about the value of the team-based learning. Can you talk about both for just a minute? Because let's use the university presidents as an example. They have 1 million stakeholders. So for those who think that they're the boss, they also have a boss. I mean, everybody has a boss, and that's proof. They have a whole bunch of bosses. So I can imagine they are really careful and crafted about how they respond to anything, from that interview to how it's perceived afterwards to everything else. So if you're trying to teach a university president, which I'm sure you are, then how do they respond? How do the leaders respond to being taught in a group where people have different roles and responsibilities and they wear this veneer? And does it help them to then be part of this group and to free up, or do you need to carve out some individual learning approaches for some people?
I think you nailed it, right. And I'll put it also in the context of technology. So team-based learning provides both those who have experience maybe in the topic being covered to share some of their personal experience and anecdotes.
Right.
I remember a session that we did at Southern Methodist University, and it was with the academic leaders, the deans, and Elizabeth Laboda, who is the provost for the university, elected to participate. And it was wonderful. And that happens quite a bit. We'll have a dean session. The president will participate, the chancellor, the vice chancellor, the provost. Love that when it happens, because there's a bit of discovery in that as well, really getting to know your other academic leaders. So I think it actually shows a high level of vulnerability. I think it shows accessibility to what would be like the provost council in that case. And Elizabeth, by her very nature, is that kind of leader. But I think to your point, the other value that comes out of an individual targeted conversation is taking the context of the learning experience that may have happened in that case with a bunch of deans in the room, and then bringing it down to an individual level. What we learn, what we experience, how does that apply to you? And that many times, university leaders, unit leaders, appreciate that more one-on-one experience. So we call those clinics, right? So we have a group learning experience, and then you boil it down. If you wanted, like in the professional development realm, we call that coaching. But when we're working with academic leaders, we found that just describing it as clinics makes a lot more sense. And now it's all about really, what do you need personally? And that's the whole context of where I think what technology has allowed us to do is really identify ways to provide more individualized training experiences. So that clinics experience prior to the pandemic, those would have had to be scheduled on site and, done in sort of and this too from even as we're doing feasibilities, organizations do feasibility studies, right? It used to be you come on site, you do a series of interviews, and you have to get everybody scheduled for like 2 or 3 days and all these interviews. What technology has allowed us to do is to take that more personalized experience, a coaching experience, and put it in this environment, put it in a virtual setting, and allow everybody to participate. Now we can schedule those out over, in a way that's most conducive to their schedule. And technology has also allowed the ability to be more targeted, right? Mm-hmm. So somebody goes through a training experience but wants reinforcement in a specific area. Now I can do something that's much more tailored to me. Like take a learning module, a learning experience that's highly customized to me. I take it on my own, focusing on an area that I want to improve. And so you look at like the growth of LinkedIn Learning and other platforms, right, that provide highly, and some of them are very short sessions, some are longer sessions, but tailored to the individual's specific needs. And that's where I think technology has really empowered individual learning to be done at scale in a way that we didn't see prior to the pandemic. So I think adoption through the pandemic and after the pandemic has really shifted us more towards technology for those individual learning experiences.
Just a question on that, which is when you mention LinkedIn Learning, I think of highly produced. It's sort of like masterclass, except more tailored. And I'm wondering, does sometimes that have a downside? Like when we're talking right like this, it's kind of raw. I mean, both from the resolution of the image through Zoom, but also the way we're going to edit it later will be essentially a raw cut, so people have access to the full conversation. But it's not this kind of highly, stylized kind of thing that we might see if we were YouTubers. So is there an advantage and a disadvantage in doing something highly stylized and produced over something that's raw And how does that affect, both the people they're learning from the content, but also maybe the people you're interviewing?
So I think there's an easy response that just because it's easy doesn't mean it's the wrong response, which is by every learner learns differently. And the pros for one person might be cons for somebody else. And so a group and learning environment may be really uncomfortable for somebody, particularly if it's a longer session.
Sure.
Whereas a more individual experience or coaching experience would be much more appropriate. Others love the group learning experience and those types of things, and don't really get as much out of a more individualized experience. So what I think the general statement would be there's probably no one perfect way to provide a training experience. And so providing a multitude of different options allows individuals to be given, or in some cases even required, right? So I look at many of our organizations, training is not optional. It's part of your professional development. It's part of the expectation that you would participate.
Yeah, please repeat that, because I mean, really, this is an investment for working with you. But I mean, for any organization who's with us in the room, some level of training to do the kinds of things that you're doing these interviews, and then to train your staff to be able to conduct meaningful conversations is essential, right?
Yeah, and the reality is every organization that makes a choice to do training is making the choice to have that be an investment of their team's time. So it's an investment in the cost of training, but it's also an investment in the time. And I don't think that, I think many participants recognize at the surface level that the organization is making an investment in them, but sometimes it's the perception that it's a burden, right? Like this is taking away from what I need to do. And the reality, the other side of that coin is it is making you better at what you're doing. And your organization has been intentional about selecting this approach to help because it provides the best option to the team as a whole. And this also goes back to even experienced people who are willing to be curious and learn will find something in a training session. I look at like professional athletes that still do blocking and tackling drills, even though they may have been in the sport for 20 years. You still go out and you do blocking and tackling drills because it's the basics. And if we get the fundamentals wrong, all of the other stuff that we've learned is harder to do. So many times training from an adoption perspective does come to the institution saying, hey, this is in alignment with our culture. And when it's most successful, and this is something that I think I really want, Jay, for people to hear and to know, is when it's successful, the culture of the organization is the lead in any conversation around training. Anything we do should be driven by the culture of the organization, right? Culture is really who we are. But if training is done right, it only reinforces that, right? It's what we do and it's how we do it, right? So if we think about training being an echo of sorts of good culture, but then sometimes, and this comes back to the technology component, talk about the collision of these two,
right?
The technology can sometimes be a bit of the tail wagging the dog, right? Because if the culture is set and the direction is set, we're going to take a donor-centric approach to philanthropy, and this is how we're going to do it, and this is what we're going to do, then the technology should just be the tools we use. And where sometimes we see misalignment is when an organization has adopted a technology that's not in alignment with their culture.
Can you give an example of this to make it really tangible for
I'll make it super tangible. So if I'm using let's say I'm using a communication platform or an engagement platform, and I have and there's a process built into that, and it's not reflecting the culture of the organization, it's going to create a disconnect for those using it who are trying to do what the organization's leadership says, this is how we approach donors. And so it may be that the tool that they're using is telling them, okay, you need to contact a donor every month. No matter what, you got to contact a donor every month. It may tell them you need to have them sign up for this many things, right? It may say that we need to we're off track with a donor if we haven't done something in a certain period of time. Now, if what the conversation, the human conversation with the donor is saying is, hey, I don't want to get all that information. I don't want, right? I need a 2-year pause while we finish up this other thing before we start major philanthropy with the university. And our tools don't allow us to have that donor-centric approach. It misses the real purpose of what we're trying to do in building relationships between donors and the institution. And so it's working well. The technology is a tool that does reinforce the process and the culture that the organization built. And that's what we're looking for. We always are looking for technology that does exactly that.
I want to ask you about scaling tech for learning. Because much of what we've been talking about, I think, in my head, has been about a small collection of leaders who are interacting with a small collection of really of individuals who can have a profound impact on an institution. But those are the people who have matured in that relationship, both as leaders internally and externally. So there are all these other people out there, some of whom are giving at more modest levels because they haven't been involved, or because they don't have the resources yet, or they're trying to still make those decisions themselves. And yet others are members of the community who have never been asked to be involved. And the discussion we've had the last couple of years about donor-centric versus, I don't like this archetype, but anyway, donor-centric versus community-centric, which I think is kind of a strange notion. But I'm wondering if technology can help to bridge that so that we can scale some of this learning, both for the community as well as for our teams. Because what you've described sounds like it's not just for the president or for a major gifts officer at University of Cambridge, but it sounds like it would be very beneficial to have a way to scale learning for a social service agency or a place that has chapters around the country and works with people to build houses. So talk about scale.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Let's think about it maybe in a different framework. One of the challenges that those social service organizations tend to face is moving towards a more individual focused philanthropy strategy. So whether we like it or not, wealth inequality exists in our country. And in that space that we're in this time that we're in with wealth inequality, what it is, the effectiveness and efficiency of team members in philanthropy, so those that would serve in a fundraising role with, let's say, Habitat for Humanity, right? So we'll pick one just to make it easy. I love Habitat for Humanity, volunteered there quite a bit. I think it's a great organization. Habitat, if you're on here, you do a great job. Love what you do. But the reality is, too, that in Habitat for Humanity, you have to have both scale communications. You need to create awareness and buy-in to what Habitat for Humanity is. You recognize it's very volunteer-driven, so you have engagement that's very scalable at Habitat for Humanity. So then the next step is, what does it look like to take those that are willing to give to Habitat for Humanity of resources, of money, not just their time, volunteering? What does it look like to connect with them? And dedicating, for both training purposes, to understand how do we engage individuals in a deeper conversation around how they can have an impact through their philanthropy, understanding what they want to be. But if they're gonna be a donor, we want to start to connect with them at a more individual level. Now we can certainly make a broad ask of our community to support Habitat for Humanity because it does good things. But where we're going to find our biggest donors are those like me who would advocate for Habitat for Humanity, volunteer for Habitat for Humanity, would be willing to serve on a board for Habitat for Humanity because we know the impact of the work and it is personally important to us versus just giving to Habitat for Humanity because it's a good cause, right? And so part of this shift is also technology allows for, we've offered, I'm going to call it public workshops. But prior to the pandemic, all of our public workshops were done in person in a big city like Atlanta or Chicago or Houston or LA. And overseas, we do them in Toronto and we do them in Vancouver and we do them in Sydney and we do them in London. But Now what we can do is we can take this global community, and AFP is doing a great job of this. AHP is doing a great job of this. CASE is doing a great job of this, but bringing a global community together to learn through a virtual platform. And I think that's where the opportunity is, because you can lower the price point for delivery, you can lower the price point for the learning experience, and you can increase then who has the opportunity to participate. That's what technology allows us to do. And it's not that the technology wasn't available. We started building our first virtual class for philanthropy training in 2019. And we completed it. Jay, I'm no joke. We completed that design of that class in January of 2020. First one we were
timing.
It took us a full year to build, a full year.
Right.
And now what you're able to do, and again, the associations are doing it, we're doing it. I mean, now you can offer people the opportunity to participate and learn, lower price point, virtual experience, but with people from all over the country. And it's because the technology now has been adopted by the learner. See, the barrier prior to 2020 was that people didn't want to learn that.
It's so true.
Yeah. And now they do. And so that's changed the ability, and the cost of delivery has come down, right? When we talk about inflation and all other areas, what's actually costs less now is the opportunity to participate in things like this because of platforms like this. And I look at it, a person who will take our cornerstone class, which is the Art and Science of Donor Development, which is all about what we talked about here on Discovery, will pay about half as much if they participate virtually as if they do it in person. And yet they'll get the same number of CFRE credits, they'll get the same experience. It's just a virtual experience versus an in-person experience. Still learning groups, still instructor-led, still have the videos, but done in an environment where they can participate from their home office.
Is that something that's open to a wide variety? I mean, who can benefit from that?
Any fundraiser, anyone who is going to be sitting down in an individual giving conversation. And you made the point, like, donor centric versus community centric. I think it's an absurd argument. It's both and, right? We can serve our community, and we can also be curious about what donors are looking to accomplish. Donor-centric philanthropy is not about the organization doing what the donor wants. It's about the organization asking the donor, what do they want to do? And then figuring out what's the closest alignment in what the institution offers. But anyone, and we have participants in those public sessions from universities, hospitals, health systems, Habitat for Humanity, and others that are in the community nonprofit space. So,
and before we go on to maybe a final question or wrap up thought, I want to make sure that we let people know where they can learn about that. So where could they learn about that session, as well as maybe the rest of what you do about this community?
Yep. Everything is available through our website, which is www.advancementresources.org. And right there on the homepage, you'll see what we do. You can see samples of the videos that we've been talking about, the interviews that we've been talking about, and you'll be able to see our public workshop offerings, which is both the virtual and in person.
Okay. And as you said, these other organizations that we all know and love, from AFP to CASE to APRA, et cetera, they all do wonderful work. This is one more thing that we can do to hone our skills. But it's also interesting because you've been doing this not just in terms of just the tech developing, but our relationship to the tech evolving. Both the people you're interviewing, but also the people who on the staff who were not really ready for this. Many were not accustomed to working like this. I think both of us have worked virtually for a long time, but a lot of people weren't accustomed to that, and it felt strange, alien, impersonal. People were not able to be themselves. Well, after 3 years of Zoom meetings, I think there are some deficiencies, perhaps. I'm sure you can talk more about that. But also people are probably more comfortable being themselves, and not just the proverbial joke about wearing pajamas on the bottom and a dress shirt on the top. I mean, really just being able to talk about life and being able to do work, do both those things just like you would in an office, maybe sometimes more efficiently. Anyway, but that's where we are. Where are we going? So you've been looking at this kind of trajectory, and you're already seeing kind of where the donors are going, where the leaders are going, but also where the field is going. What are you anticipating as the next building blocks for utilizing tech in a way that's useful to make us better at what we do, but also to make it easier for donors to engage with us in a real way so it's not transactional.
And I want to offer too that if anyone that is attending has questions, if you'd like to put them in the Q&A, please go ahead and do that. I think the biggest thing that's ahead of us is actually realizing what we've been working on for years. I remember going to a meeting of advancement leaders that were working specifically in the talent space, talking about, wouldn't it be great if, this would have been back in about 2016. And the discussion was around customization, individual learning plans, the ability to get to a place where we could be very adaptive in our learning modules. And I've seen some institutions just do phenomenal work in this space. Erin Westfall is one of, I think, the leaders in this space. She was at Michigan. She was then at Cambridge. And she's really been intentional about this type of work. We've seen a lot of institutions sort of jump in to really thinking strategically about how do we customize learning plans, and technology gives us that capability. And so now we have the ability to both imagine it and actually execute it. And again, it comes back to providing a combination of resources, depending on the individual, their skill level, what they need, what their manager thinks they need, and the role that they're going to be filling. And I think that's a really exciting place. And I think the next 4 or 5 years is the ability to do that scale. Even small institutions without professional talent managers being able to adopt that model of scalable learning experiences that are customized to the individual needs. The other thing that I think is really exciting is adoption of tool-specific training, right? So taking a platform that the institution has decided to adopt, so let's call it BBCRM, and or the tool that DonorSearch has, DSAI, and being able to say this tool used in this way allows us to accomplish this, but putting it in context, not only of what buttons to push and what screens will show up, but how do I use it day in and day out in the work that I'm doing. So really helping organizations leverage up their technology by making sort of case studies or specific training around what happens in the field when one uses those tools. And there's still big opportunity in that space, so that those that are doing the fundraising have access to those very powerful tools and know how to use it. And again, I don't think that has to be 5 years out. My hope is that can be accelerated, but it's a commitment both on the part of those providing the technology and those designing and deploying the learning to collaborate and make sure that those two things are matched up, right? What the organization is trying to achieve, the technology they're deploying, that the team members using it have the ability to learn in that framework.
What's been the biggest surprise?
I don't know. It's so many of them. How much has changed? I mean, I say the pandemic itself was a huge tipping point in a willingness to use technology in a different way. I think it was part of the millennial generation and the Gen Z coming into the workplace also, who are just technology natives. But how quickly this shift to accepting this type of space happened. And it happened because it had to. And I saw at the beginning of this year, the adoption of ChatGPT happened so quickly. And I got kind of excited, like, hey, maybe we're at that same kind of tipping point. And what I'm excited about is what's next. What's the next thing that we're going to experience, going to drive us to, that will make us even more efficient. But technology and learning, they need they can coexist, but to do it, organizations need to be really intentional about bringing those two things together to accomplish what they're trying to do in their culture.
And all the things you've said are kind of human applications of technology, as opposed to kind of the things we all feared, like the Ready Player One, headsets and holographic figures, and you haven't advocated for any of those things, I'm happy to hear. Or, I guess virtual versions of ourselves asking donors for support. So nothing to fear here.
In the metaverse, right? In the metaverse, we'll learn
in the
how.
metaverse.
Hey, Advancement Resources needs a training center in the metaverse. That's really what you're talking about. I will say it's not what I'm excited about, but that doesn't mean I haven't imagined it could be part of our future, Jay.
I think that's the only place I'm likely to meet Mackenzie Scott and interview her would be in the metaverse. But who knows?
Her avatar, yeah, absolutely. No, it's been a pleasure, Jay. I really appreciate the time today. Great questions, and Jack, thank you for your effort to keep all of this, put all this together, and make it happen.
Well, it's been a great conversation, Ben. I really appreciate your insights, as well as everything you do to teach the rest of us. And encourage people to go and take a look at that link that's in the chat, so you can see more about what you do, but also how possibly people can learn from it and apply it where you are, as well as the trainings that are open to people. I also want to encourage everybody to stick around for a minute, because you're going to see a link here, a QR code. So pull out your phones if you don't have them already, so you can learn more about our sponsor, DonorSearch, but also where the next sessions in this series will be, including one next week, which is me sitting here talking with you, telling you some of the horror stories of fundraising that I've been collecting now for over 20 years. And they include everything from the ridiculous and hilarious to murder, actually two. So both happening on our watch. Then you can be a part of that discussion and maybe even share anonymously your stories, either by sending them directly to me, or you can show up and hopefully we'll be able to turn on the audio and let you talk anonymously. Just be on your best behavior. That's all coming up next week. That's the horror stories of fundraising on what else? Halloween, October 31st. So I hope you'll join us for that, as well as sessions for the rest of the series and into next year. Any suggestions you have, just write me a note. That's JAY at donorsearch.net. Jack, if you can put that in the chat, I'd appreciate that. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Till then, take care. Thanks again, John.